Morning. Glad to be with you, and I'm going to dispense with the pleasantries and cut right into it because I'm anxious to talk with you about an issue that I frankly think you guys could probably be decisive in fixing. And for reasons that will become apparent in a moment, if they aren't already, it is a matter of life and death for our republic. And I don't mean just the political piece of it, I mean the whole Megillah to get it fixed. What am I talking about? We're going to change the grid, the electric grid of the United States, the bulk power distribution system, which you know more about than I, one way or the other. The perturbation in the force that I'm referring to is, I think, for reasons I'm going to talk to you about, well, it's not entirely clear when it's going to happen or who's going to make the change or to what effect change is coming. Let me go through a couple of reasons why. There are extraordinarily ominous threats emerging. Not so long ago, we recognized, commemorated the 13th anniversary of this episode. The people who looked at it in a federal commission said it was a failure of imagination that caused us to miss the warnings that people were going to fly planes into buildings to advance what you were talking about with Scott a moment ago, the grand global jihad. Well, I'm going to talk to you about some failures of imagination right now. I'm going to connect some dots for you. This little squirrel is no longer the president of Iran, but even when he was, he didn't actually run the place. But this was the policy of his government, to impose this doctrine of Sharia worldwide, to do it first and foremost to the little Satan, Israel, by wiping it off the map, and then to get to the great Satan. In fact, he memorably said at the United Nations and elsewhere, "A world without America is not only desirable, it is achievable." And that caused me, I spent a lot of my life in the national security business, to wonder, how does a two-bit country like Iran, admittedly one with a lot of oil, create conditions under which there is a world without the greatest superpower history has ever known? Well, let's talk about that. Could it possibly be that there's more of the kind of terrorism these guys have engaged in, at least since 1979, against us? Possibly. How about cyber warfare? They've been doing some of that, mostly in a fairly small-scale way. Or the president announced the other day he's really concerned about somebody detonating a nuclear weapon in one of our cities, perhaps New York. Ladies and gentlemen, each and every one of those things would be a bad thing, particularly for the people most immediately involved. But it's not a world without America. There's another possibility, though, one that has these qualities. It's practicable, it is highly cost-effective, it could be done in the near term, and depending on how it's done, conceivably, you could leave no fingerprints as to who was responsible. What could that be? Well, let's start with this. This is the footprint of something called a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse. It could be created most efficiently by detonating off of a ballistic missile, a nuclear weapon at apogee, ideally at something like 300 nautical miles. This is a little bit lower, but if you put it right over, say, Cleveland, nobody on the ground would feel any of the effects of the blast, because that's outside of the atmosphere, but they will shortly feel the effects of what comes next. But let me address the question of how does a country like Iran, which isn't supposed to have an intercontinental range ballistic missile until next year, get a nuclear weapon over a place like Cleveland? Well, here's how they could do it. It's called the Scud in a tub scenario. And a blue ribbon commission chartered by the Congress to look into this possible threat said this is a perfectly plausible way to do it. This is a Scud, where am I? A Scud missile. There it is, the laser. Scud here. This is a container that could be, in an artist's rendering, modified to conceal a launcher for a ballistic missile. The Russians, by the way, have for sale containers like that that can launch cruise missiles. There's no reason why they couldn't put a ballistic missile in there as well. Well, how realistic a possibility is that? Somebody bringing a relatively short-range missile close to our shore so they didn't have to have a long-range one. And oh, by the way, since perhaps you launched it from a ship, maybe nobody figures out who was responsible for it. Well, there was this scenario, interestingly enough, last July a year ago. A ship called the Chonggang, a North Korean flagged vessel, was intercepted going through the Panama Canal. People thought there might be drugs aboard it. It had come out of Cuba, but under the 10,000 tons of sugar in its hold were two of these on their launchers. They're SA-2s. If you're of a certain age, you may remember those were the pretty rudimentary but effective anti-aircraft missiles that the Soviets used to take down Gary Powers in the early days of the Cold War when he was flying his U-2 over the Soviet Union. Why is that a problem? Well, North Korea may just be a country who is interested in attacking the United States. Why do I say that? Well, there was this photograph taken in April of last year in which the little dude in the middle, I call him the Dear Leader 3.0, Kim Jong-un, is shown with his general staff against a map that has the interesting title, The Strategic Forces Plan to Strike the U.S. Mainland. Could that be a clue? Well, think about this. This is a country that has not only repeatedly threatened us with nuclear attack, but actually has increasingly the means to do it, including tested nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And by the way, folks, they have been collaborating on both extensively with the Iranians. Now, interestingly enough, at the same time that photograph was taken with the Strategic Forces Plan to attack the U.S. mainland prominently displayed, something was going on over precisely that footprint that I showed you a moment ago. This is the orbital trajectory of a satellite that the North Koreans had launched in such a fashion that it came up from the south, that is to say, the same direction as those SA-2s might have been fired from. Those are nuclear-armed, or nuclear-capable missiles, that is, not armed in this case. But had they, or indeed had this satellite, been fitted out with a nuclear weapon, and it had been detonated at a high altitude, in this case it's just about the ideal altitude as a matter of fact, on one of those dates, it would have put that EMP footprint over much of the United States, which, as you'll see, is kind of a problem. This, by the way, just gives you a sense of, we have some experience. Some of you may have lived through this or had to contend with it. This is, of course, the blackout that took place back in 2003 when a tree branch touched a power line in northern Ohio, knocking out the power from Michigan to New England. This is what it looked like when there was a relatively orderly exit from Manhattan in the midst of that. Fortunately, it was a hot summer day. Lives were not threatened by inclement weather and so on, but it was a messy bit of business for 2 days. Well, let's go back to this footprint. I'm sure all of you know what's underneath that. About 75% of the nation's power generation capabilities, and about 83% of its large high-voltage transformers, which, as you know, look like that. This is a handy little guide to both the size of these things and the difficulty of getting them from point A to point B, which is made particularly problematic because we mostly need to get them to point A from someplace else. You're probably all aware of the difficulties, the ponderous nature of producing these things. This is really a dependency on offshore supply that could be fatal. Naturally, as I'm sure those of you with more technical experience than I know, this is not the only way that you could do violence to the grid. It happens those high-altitude EMPs could be pretty efficient. Wholesale, nationwide blackouts could be conceivably achieved. But let's go through some of the other ideas. People in this room could do this, I'm sure. I couldn't, but if you could go to Radio Shack and pick up the right elements, you can put together a handy little radio frequency weapon. Or you could just buy yourself an EMP tester that are conveniently fitted out and sold on the open market, completely unregulated, in suitcases. Put one of these things or one of those into a truck, pull it up against your local substation, and you can achieve retail what that high-altitude EMP could do wholesale. Think that has occurred to anybody? Well, here are 3 different pop culture outlets that have all featured radio frequency weapons in some of their programming. Cyber. Everybody here is, I'm sure, concerned about cyber. It is a serious problem, as the Bipartisan Policy Center indicated back in February of 2014. The sophistication and frequency of attacks on the electric grid using cyber techniques is increasing. These are just examples of how that's been manifesting itself. One just to note of particular concern to me is that back in July, the Department of Homeland Security warned that something that looked a lot like the Stuxnet malware that we and the Israelis inserted into Iranian centrifuges to try to slow up their nuclear weapons program has been engineered, modified, and stuck into 1,000 control systems for utilities on this side of the Atlantic and in Europe, which is kind of a problem. Then there's this. I'm sure out this way, at least all of you know about the attack that took place, interestingly enough, about the same time that that photograph was taken of Kim Jong-un and his guys. An attack on this substation known as Metcalf outside of San Jose, California. I don't know if you're all familiar with the particulars of it, but basically some unknown number of guys broke into 2 manhole covers in proximity to this site, got down inside them, expertly cut the telecommunications lines, including the 911 system for this site, in such a way that it would be exceedingly difficult to repair. Put the manhole covers back on, covered them up to make it look as though nobody had molested them, moved out to pre-sighted firing positions and plugged 120 rounds into this complex, AK-47 style automatic weapons. They punctured the cooling radiators of 17 of the 21 of those high voltage transformers. And but for the grace of God and the fact that they missed one communications link to an off-site control center, and the guys in that control center saw the the pressure in those radiators dropping and the temperature in those transformers rising, and did an emergency power down, we would have lost not only the 17, but probably the other 4 that weren't actually directly hit. Which, I'm told, would probably have meant that not only San Jose, but Silicon Valley and most of the San Francisco Bay Area would have been without power possibly for years. Think about it. We would not be having this conversation for sure if they had not missed that one link. So, who are those masked men? We don't know. They got away. My working assumption is they're still at large. And subsequent to this attack, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission asked if somebody actually successfully attacked in this fashion or some number of critical substations around the country, how many would it take to take down the grid nationwide? I think they were shocked. I'm certain I was. Perhaps you will be. The answer was 9. In other words, an eminently doable do if you've got a gang or a couple of them like this. This is not the only instance of a physical attack. As you probably are aware, there have been a number of others. One of my personal favorites is a group called the Knights Templar Gang, a drug trafficking cartel out of Mexico, shut down the grid of the Mexican state of Michoacan back in April of 2014. In the dark of night, they proceeded to whack a number of the law enforcement, judicial, and other rival gangs' leadership. We had Al-Qaeda take out the entire grid of the nation of Yemen. Not that big a grid, I guess, but they did nonetheless take it down. In Nogales, right down by the border, in June, somebody put an improvised explosive device next to a large diesel fuel tank. Fortunately, it didn't go, had it, 30,000 people in the dark for a very long time, and the border even more porous than it is at the moment. So, Oh, did I mention that there was a 2.0 version of the attack on the Metcalf substation last week? Not a shooting incident this time. People simply broke in and stole stuff. I have the feeling that we don't know the full truth of what happened there any more than we were told the full truth the last time. We were told it was just an act of vandalism the first time, until the Wall Street Journal broke the story in February of this year. And interestingly enough, we're supposed to have had all kinds of physical safety improvements put in place at the Metcalf substation by PG&E, which owns it. There were supposed to be improvements to the physical security standards nationwide, as a matter of fact. This does not inspire confidence, ladies and gentlemen, needless to say. Let me just posit something for you, though, that really got my attention when I first tumbled to it about a year ago, and that is that even if none of the things that I've just gone through with you, not the high-altitude EMP, not the physical attacks, not the cyber attacks, the radiological warfare, despite all of the evidence that people we know are out there and have demonstrated both an interest and, to varying degrees, a capability to do this sort of violence to our grid, let's just say none of those things happens. This is going to happen. We had a close encounter this weekend, by the way, as, again, you may well know. Fortunately, while it was a big one, it was mostly directed someplace else and was just kind of glancing blow. But every 150 years or so, one of these big geomagnetic disturbances, solar flares for most of us, comes off of the sun. It happens all the time, but it comes off of the sun and goes directly to that little thing, which is to scale pretty small. That's, by the way, the distance is not to scale, but when one of those things comes off, fine point, when one of those things comes off and heads our way, it isn't pretty. In fact, the last time, that was what we had in the way of critical infrastructure of an electric kind, and it smoked them. Telegraph lines caught on fire, telegraph offices burnt to the ground. A scientist in Britain by the name of Richard Carrington happened to make the correlation between the sunspots that he was observing and the fires that were lighting up along the telegraph lines. That has caused people to think that, especially since even when you have less power for solar storms that can do that kind of damage to these kinds of transformers, it's going to be a really bad thing if one of those Carrington events happens. For example, the National Academy of Sciences estimated that it would cost us roughly $1 to $2 trillion to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after, if I can pursue that metaphor, the eggs have been scrambled by a Carrington-class event. In the meantime, it would take something on the order of 4 to 10 years to do it. Do I have your attention? This is busy, but the gist of it is this. This is by an outfit that knows something about risk, Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's estimated that even a less powerful storm, say a quarter of the power of the Carrington event of 1859, took place, something on the order of 20 to 40 million Americans would be without power for up to 2 years. Now that's just an estimate. And if we have a failure of imagination, perhaps we will pay no attention to what might happen if that actually eventuates. This is an interesting data point. Colleagues of mine in presentations to the Congress in May said the probability of this Carrington-class event, or perhaps worse, hitting the world at some point is 1.0. It absolutely, positively will happen. We just don't know when. Again, you all know this better than I. Why that is such a problem is that this is just one of the infrastructures that would be affected. The electric power grid powers every other one of those critical infrastructures, and that gives rise to a serious problem, especially when as we were told by NASA recently, there is a 12% probability that this will happen in the next decade. Now, for those of you into these sorts of things, a 6-cylinder revolver would give you a slightly worse probability if you were to play Russian roulette with it, but I think this is close enough for government work, don't you? Would anybody voluntarily play Russian roulette personally, let alone with the nation? I think not. If this is as bad as I'm saying it is, don't you think somebody would have mentioned it before now, let alone have done something about it? Is this a secret? Or is it simply not so? Well, we put together a little booklet, and I'm sorry, I had thought for some reason that there were going to be enough for all of you, but you can download them for free at securethegrid.com. You can get them by Amazon. You can buy them in bulk for everybody you ever met, which is recommended. But let me just tell you what it is. This is a compilation of the executive summaries of 11 different studies that have been performed by or for the federal government in the past decade. And whether they looked at the problem that we just talked about the sun and what it could do, or they looked at the cyber threat, or they looked at the EMP threat, or they looked at the physical sabotage threat, every single one of them came back with the same conclusion. It is an existential threat to the United States of America if one or the other of those things takes down the grid for any protracted period of time. There have been, by the way, I don't know if you can make this out, 2 additional studies since we put that thing together in February or thereabouts. One by Battelle, the other by the Congressional Research Service. Same conclusion. Here's the bottom line with respect to those findings. This isn't a secret. The government knows about it. These studies are all in the public domain, so other people know about it. Not least, all of our enemies know about it. Unfortunately, there are people in the dark about this, and I would suggest that they are the American people as a whole, and the question is, are we going to persist in this failure of imagination? Are we going to persist in ignoring these data and perhaps leave them in the dark permanently? What would that mean? According to the author of the first of those studies, the chairman of that group, the EMP Threat Commission, 9 out of 10 Americans aren't going to make it if the lights go out and stay out over a large area. Why is that? Well, that's because, as I showed you in that earlier slide, the cascading effect through all of those infrastructures that are critical to life as we know it, that goes away. A lot of people do too. We can't sustain the population we have, even in a country as richly endowed as this, when so few of us know the first thing about how to live off the land, which is what we would be largely reduced to. That translates into destruction of property, environmental damage of an unimaginable kind, and societal breakdown, I think, is inevitable. And frankly, the only thing you can do, there's a lot of talk about prepping, and I'm good with that, and maybe some of you are doing it, but let's face it, very few of us are likely to be able to amass, let alone retain, what you would need to live, other than off the land, for probably more than a month, or maybe 2. In which case, you're likely not to be in that 10%. And by the way, somebody pointed out to me the other day, sort of a wag, that if you are in that 10%, you're not going to like the company you're keeping. So why is it, if this is all true, if many of us, at least at the senior government levels, have every reason to know this is true, and that it is as dire as I have described it to be, why has nothing been done? Why has nothing, as a practical matter, been done to ensure that the grid of the United States, upon which we all depend critically, survives? And I think the short answer is nobody's in charge. And everybody who has a piece of this thinks somebody else ought to actually be responsible for trying to fix it. My old institution, the United States Pentagon, for example. Even though, get this, 99% of the federal Department of Defense's facilities in this country are dependent upon the civilian grid, they think it's somebody else's job to protect them. They're having trouble, as you may have noticed, and Scott can attest to this, just doing their day job, let alone hardening the critical infrastructure. The utilities, who are largely owning about 85% of this infrastructure, as you know, think it is a national security problem, if it's a problem at all, and they're not altogether persuaded of that, frankly, but if it is a problem, it's certainly not their job to fix it. The Pentagon should pay for it. And even if the costs, as is generally our experience, I think, get passed on to somebody else, there's another reason that seems to be operating with some, at least in this industry, and that is they've got a regulatory sweetheart arrangement. It goes back to the 19th century. There's nothing else like it that I know of, at least at present, in terms of self-regulation of an absolutely critical piece of the national enterprise. And they don't want that changed. So the sort of default answer on the part of, and I'm not saying everybody in industry, but I am saying the people who represent the industry, notably the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, the stock answer, the default setting is there's not a problem, folks. And if it is, we've got it under control. Trust us. And if we don't exactly have it under control right now, we're working on it. And we will have it under control shortly. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along, in other words. Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's acceptable in light of what really is at stake. So, we're trying to effect something else to change the grid, but change it in a positive way as opposed to what these various threats might do. We've put together something we call the Secure the Grid Coalition. It's co-chaired by these two gentlemen, Republican Newt Gingrich, former House Speaker, Democrat Jim Woolsey, former Director of Central Intelligence under President Clinton. It's made up of these kinds of characters, people that you probably know or know of in some cases. Smart, knowledgeable, deeply experienced, and very engaged on this particular problem. What kinds of things are we doing? I don't know if you can really read this or not, but basically it's all ends against the middle. I can't think of anything more important than getting this fixed, so we're doing absolutely everything we can think of, with frankly limited resources, to try to work the problem at the federal level, at the state level, engaging the media in various fashions, engaging people in Hollywood to help us tell the story to the pop culture, through the pop culture to the public, trying to get the regulators to do their job. Not just the NERC, which actually has the responsibilities for setting the standards in this space, but also the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which doesn't really have much authority over setting those standards. They more or less just get to rubber stamp them. But we're trying to get them to engage. We're trying to work with industry, and that's why when I was given the chance to come talk to you, I jumped at it. Because as I said at the beginning, I really do think you are perhaps critical to the solution. If you agree with me that this is a problem, and if you perhaps agree with me that this is as important as any problem we face. And the beauty of this is, frankly, I worry about a lot of problems, including some of the ones that Scott's talked to you about. And there are a lot of them that are really scary. None of them that I know of is as tractable as this is. This is something we can actually do something about. Why is that? Well, because we know what to do. How do we know what to do? Among other things, we know what to do because these guys in the five-sided building, in which I worked for 4.5 years, have been hardening things against threats like electromagnetic pulse for over 50 years, with tens of billions of your tax dollars in the process expended to protect principally our nuclear forces and the command and control systems that operate them. What do those things look like? Well, in the case of the military, and again, you know much more about this than I, they're things like surge protectors. You've got fancier terms for them than that, but that's the way I think of it because that's what I plug my computer into. Capacitors, shunts, for moving the pulse around what you're trying to protect, and Faraday cages to shield them from other emissions. And yet nothing has been done, despite the fact that all of those technologies have been known, have been developed, have been applied, are pretty prosaic, are not very expensive to get the civilian grid and other critical infrastructures fixed. And that's despite the fact, as this EMP Threat Commission concluded, it's not that big a deal. It's not that expensive. Indeed, they came up with an estimate, and I can't either say it's right or wrong, but it seems to me it's probably low, of $2 billion to protect the electric grid against electromagnetic pulse threats. And in the process to protect it against other hazards as well, which is the way we ought to do this, obviously. Let's say that's off by a factor of 10. It's still coffee money relative to the costs of trying to put the country back together again, if you could do it. Let me leave you with this last inducement to action. If you have not been moved by items 1 through 3, maybe old-fashioned profit might appeal to you. Why? Well, by some estimates, we lose about $2 billion a year, according to an insurance company, Zurich, either as a result of utilities or their customers suffering the effects of some of those smaller power surges or some of the blackouts that come from other kinds of attacks on the grid. So there's some money. Let me just note that it is, I'm told, a patriotic group here that I'm speaking to. Hopefully that second item would also appeal to you. But here's this. I was talking with a chap in the industry of protecting assets, including military and stuff like yours. He says that over the next 10 years, there's an estimate it'll be roughly $100 billion invested in protecting critical infrastructure, both by the government and by the private sector. Well, there's some money. And then if you happen to be of the political character, there, I think, are votes as well to be won. So whether it's patriotism, whether it's political expediency, or whether it's just the opportunity to get a piece of that $2 billion or $100 billion, pick your poison, we need help. And you guys, it seems to me, from what little I know about where you fit into this food chain, seem to me to be perfectly suited to play a role. You are, I gather, innovative. I'm told that the transmission guys, by contrast, spend about the same amount on R&D each year as we spend on R&D for dog food in this country. I think that's not true of you all, at least I hope not. I'm told you're entrepreneurial. You can see a changing environment. You can figure out how to position yourself to make money in it, I'm hoping, and do good as well. We desperately need this, leadership. Because otherwise you will be tarred, perhaps literally, tarred with the same brush that will ultimately be used against the electric utilities more broadly and industry. And that is, how the hell did you let this happen? Didn't you know? You knew and you didn't do anything about it? I don't think you want to be in that position. I don't want you to be in that position. You could produce equipment that is hardened. I am sure of it. That is protected against these kinds of phenomena, if you put your minds to it. And here's another idea. You could take the lead in certifying that you have hardened your equipment and that other people have or haven't. All opportunities to be part of that $100 billion makeover that I think is going to come. So, I'm done. There's money to be made. The threat is real and growing. We know about it. and I think we know what to do. So let me conclude by saying the change is coming, and the chance with it to protect the grid is part of it. It could come out better. It will certainly be more efficient, and there will be less disruption in service if people like you are in leadership roles in it. I have to say that if the utilities and electric industry more generally insists on not leading, I pray to God they will get the hell out of the way, because we can't, persist in this present arrangement. Business as usual, the self-regulation, the inaction, the denying that the problems exist is in fact unacceptable. It is an affront to our intelligence, and it is imperiling us all. And finally, I just want to leave you with this point. I really believe you can be part of the solution for all the reasons that I've mentioned. We need your leadership, and if we pull together on this, I think we can make that change come about in the grid in a positive way, rather than a way that does indeed bring about a world without America. With that, I think I have time for one question. One question? Anybody? Yes, sir. How does what? ERCOT? The question is, how does ERCOT, which is a term that I actually didn't associate with the Texas interconnect, but I'm sure it's the right term for it. As you know, there are three interconnects. There's the one east of the Rockies, the one west of the Rockies, and then Texas has its own. The guys in Texas will tell you they're less susceptible to the solar phenomenon because of their location at a relatively southerly latitude and some of the geology of their state. I don't know, maybe they're right. I will tell you this, I was out at the NOAA Space Weather Center in July. And one of the things that got my attention, and I think probably should get yours, is the guy who was the chief scientist who monitors these solar storms like the one that just missed us and the one that looked like it was coming right our way 2 years ago, except it was 7 days away from where we were. He said, the thing is, bad as that Carrington class event is, and I'm sure your math is better than mine, but you may have noticed that the last time this happened was 155 years ago in what is generally seen to be a 150-year cycle. This guy said out at Boulder, the problem is that was really bad. And if that kind of storm hit this kind of infrastructure without protection, it would be really bad. Really, really bad. But he said the truth of the matter is we don't know what the worst that space can dish out actually is. It may be worse than that Carrington class event. In fact, somewhere they've got, and again, science isn't my thing, but somewhere they've got some tree rings that suggest there was some really serious carbon impact over the planet that happened, I guess, in 150-year cycles before recorded history. So it may be that it's even worse than the Carrington class, in which case my guess is that Texas isn't going to be in such great shape there. There are pockets where they're working it. Notably, there's a wonderful guy by the name of John Houston, who's a vice president at Centerpoint, and he's actually put some company money against protecting their new control center. So nobody's going to get a pass on this, and not least, let's just say for the purpose of discussion that some island is created somewhere in the country where the power stays on. Well, how long do you think it'll be before all those 10% show up there? So my hope is that in Texas, for example, because it does have its own grid and because it can do a lot to harden it, you would have what becomes a precursor for the nation, and that everybody else is going to follow suit because they're not going to want Texas to be the only place that has reliable power. They're getting the cane. I have to go. Thank you very much for your attention. Please join this fight. SecureTheGrid.com.